So what was it like living in the 1930s? Well, it depends who you ask. Are you asking her, or are you asking her? Black Tuesday. The stock market crashed, 20% of banks failed, but this was not the only cause of the Great Depression. The crash led to deflation. Now that prices were much lower, businesses weren't making enough money. So businesses cut wages, fired many people, and lots of businesses failed completely. And worse, people couldn't get money from the banks because banks were failing. And what did President Herbert Hoover do?
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects?
No, it did not work. The Hawley-Smoot tariff was the highest tariff in peacetime history. It was so high that other countries didn't want to deal with that, and they reciprocated with high tariffs that America couldn't afford. So trade halted while businesses were overproducing and still not profiting. People just were not fans of Hoover anymore. Nasty soup was called Hoover stew, old newspapers were Hoover blankets, shanty towns were called Hoovervilles. One of the most famous was built in Washington, D.C. by World War I veterans and their families, who wanted bonuses they were promised. This incident worsened Hoover's reputation when he refused to help and sent troops to force them off with bayonets and tear gas. All their possessions were burned. Ugh, everyone was just tired of him. I'm tired of him, yet he still ran for president in 1932. This was the beginning of African Americans switching to the Democratic Party. FDR just needed to roll into office quickly, which he did with the 20th Amendment.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Films were still a big source of entertainment during the 30s. Americans needed a break to enjoy watching other people's stories on screen. The films of this decade don't give an inkling of the hardships of the Depression. People don't want to see that. They went to the movies to forget about the troubles they were facing in real life. The powerful movie industries of Southern California were not going to succumb to the economic crisis. In fact, producers were ready to step forward in film development, starting what would later be referred to as the Golden Age. Now, this was the first war film with sound. Its scenes recreating battles of World War I were nothing like moviegoers had ever experienced. There was the first movie that took place in a prison. Also, this is a type of clothing men wore in the 30s. Top coats with more square shoulders to make a man look bigger and his shoulders broader. And of course, the solid-colored fedora. This was an influential drama about the harsh prison system in the South just after World War I. It impacted the real world of prison reform. Because of this film, the train gang system was officially outlawed in 1937. Another thing to note is that costume designers for movies were the main pioneers of fashion in the decade, so what you see in most movies is what people wore. Now, people went to the movies to forget about the economic troubles of reality, and sound made them faster and more exciting. This was one of the first action-adventure films, and its battle scenes used miniature sets. Also, it stars Studmuff and Errol Flynn. Robin Hood also came out that decade, again with Errol Flynn, this time wearing bright green tights. Now, Frankenstein is considered one of the most important horror films ever made. Jack Pierce, the makeup artist, did a brilliant job. King Kong is also an important adventure, horror, romance classic. Max Steiner, who wrote the musical score, is credited to have made this film a success. And the female had to be blonde to contrast the most with the gorilla's dark fur. I'd like you to notice her hair, which is short and curly, quintessential of women in films in the 1930s. Also, her dress has buttons, which got much more expensive during the Depression, so the fact that she has buttons signifies wealth. Zippers were invented in the decade, much cheaper and common on clothing. And lastly, the dress's style. You can distinguish her dress from a dress from the 20s because of how it hugs the waist more to show her thin figure. What's also interesting is the film's heavily racist overtones. It's all about the unspoken fear of a black man with a white woman. It invoked a societal anxiety about quote-unquote black male hypersexuality. Yes, the scene with King Kong on the Empire State Building has become iconic. When was the Empire State Building built, you ask? In 1930, silly! 3,400 workers used 57,000 tons of steel and framework. The 102 floors took only a year and 45 days to complete for close to $41 million, which was $10 million less than expected. Construction started March 17, 1930 and opened May 1, 1931. When completed, it was the tallest building in the world and the tallest man-made structure of any type. The Great Depression was not going to stop America or King Kong from trying to reach the top. This is known as the greatest gangster film of the early 1930s. The attire and lead actor James Cagney were a seminal influence for gangster movies to come in later decades. In Howard Hawks' Scarface, the depiction of violence was so groundbreaking and so intense in realistic detail that upon its release, it was banned in America. Nevertheless, it had a big influence on men's fashion. The violence prompted Hollywood to begin restricting films with the Hays Production Code in 1934. America was also worried that these crime movies were inspiring real-life dangerous criminals, and J. Edgar Hoover came to the rescue, firmly establishing the FBI. On a lighter note, this was the first time musicals made their way on screen. The two biggest musicals of the decade were 42nd Street and The Gold Diggers of 1933. They were both released by Warner Bros. Busby Berkeley's choreography combined with genius cinematography made these films seem magical. A real sight for sore eyes during the Great Depression. Fred Astaire also danced his way on screen. After the success of his first film, his legs were insured for $1 million. His thin-fitting suits and slim tuxedos had a big influence on men's fashion. But the biggest song of the decade was Somewhere Over the Rainbow. The real world is shown as a drag in sepia tone, while the land of Oz is vibrantly colored. This movie was released in 1939 by MGM, who wanted to rival this movie from 1937.
Just whistle while you work, and cheerfully together we can tidy up the place. So hum a merry tune. It won't take long when there's a song to help you.
Romantic dramas were also popular in this decade because people like to watch movies about unhappy rich people. Ooh, notice her shoulder accentuations, another fashion trend from the 1930s. She's got 'em too. Also notice the men. Formal suits were solid colored while casual suits were patterned, and accessories consisted of ties and handkerchiefs. Katharine Hepburn's dress here also shows another style deriving from the 30s. The butterfly sleeves, which accentuated the shoulders, made the girth appear smaller. However, during the Depression, people liked to go to the movies to see more funny, non-depressing movies, human comedies known as screwballs. A main aspect of screwball comedies is that in the heterosexual relationship, the female dominates the male, whose masculinity is challenged. Different from many glamour-based films of the decade, this story takes place in a boarding house, and as you can see, they wear quite casual clothing for mise-en-scène purposes. Which differs greatly from this film about women in high society. The richer you were, the more decorative your hat. But perhaps the biggest movie of the decade was Gone with the Wind, a timeless classic which takes place in the American South during the Civil War. Its movie budget was $3.7 million, an unheard of amount at that time, which paid off because it went on to gross over $192 million. This movie set the record with 13 Academy Award nominations and 8 wins, including Best Supporting Actress for Hattie McDaniel. She was the first African American to win this award. Also, this was the first movie in color to win Best Picture.
and then you